Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
So Shelli, what does space have to do with it?
Well, I love that because what most people don't realize is space has to do with everything. From the clothes you're wearing, to the food you're eating, to talking to you today, using telecommunications, space is part of our everyday life. And what I did is I looked through the lens of space at my journey and pulled out a few lessons learned, interviewed 30 global thought leaders that were not necessarily in the space industry, and showed that these lessons are universal. They can apply to anybody, no matter where you are on your journey.
Excellent. Well, Shelli Brunswick, thanks so much for joining us this week. Those aficionados of the podcast, remember that we chatted back in the fall, which seems like light years ago. I'm never going to pass up a good space pun, but a lot's changed since then. Obviously, we've actually brought home the stranded astronauts from the space station. Go figure, as the world's leading space power, that was such an accomplishment. But I know that it's more than just space that we're here to talk about, and it's the lessons learned in your domain. So with that, I'm going to let you kind of take us down the path. We've come to a fork in the road. Are we here to talk about space, or are we here to talk about the lessons learned in space?
I think it's a little bit of both. During my journey, I have 4 chapters that relate to my journey, and we can talk about those shortly. But what I learned was, as I was mentoring people, they kept saying, "Oh, do you have this written down? Is there somewhere I can find it?" Or I'd give a talk somewhere. And what I realized is we all want to mentor. We all want to pay it forward. And especially at this stage of my career, I want to share that knowledge. But what I realized is you can only mentor so many people a year. So what I started doing was just that, writing it down so that I can pass these tips on to the next generation or mid-career, especially as we see artificial intelligence replacing and changing jobs rapidly over the next 5 years. This book and the series of books will help people as they navigate their journey.
Well, I love that you're taking the time to pay it forward, because as Sir Isaac Newton said, I can only see so far because I stand on the shoulders of giants, and you're a giant and you're helping others onto your shoulders with these works. So you talked about some of the lessons that you have learned. And I think the first one that's most important is that Shelli doesn't scale, right? You can only take so many plane trips per year. You can only give so many keynotes per year. And that's just a physical limit. So tell us about maybe one of the most impactful lessons that came out of your talks or your mentorships that you said, this was the burning idea that got you into writing a book.
Absolutely. Well, I never thought I'd write a book. I had always said, everybody says, I'll write a book one day. But what happened was another leader reached out and said, I'm writing a book for women in STEM, and I'd love if you would write a chapter about your journey. And that's how it started. What I did is I started that book. It was about women in STEM. And again, I was like, I don't really want to talk about my story so much. So I talked a little bit, and I reached out to a couple of my friends and said, hey, I'm going to add your story to my chapter. And that's how I submitted the chapter. And that book is out. And it's been really successful. And that sparked that, you know what? This is a great way to write a book. I don't have to write a book about me because that's boring, I think. What I can do is I'd rather highlight other people's journeys.
Right.
And that's exactly what I did. So the stories in the book are not just random strangers I met. They're actually people I've met during my journey, whether it was work related or organizations or volunteer work. That's how I accumulated these individuals at more than 200. And I only fit 30 in a book. So 3 per chapter. So each book will have 30 global thought leader insights.
That's amazing. And that's really I appreciate you sharing that. That was a huge insight for this podcast, was you meet people or you have coffee or whatever, and you're like, wow, like that, I've got to take a walk around the block just to digest what we covered. And you're definitely one of the people who fit that bill as a repeat guest here on the podcast. So with that being said, like when you're talking about these leadership lessons that really you're talking to folks, give us maybe an example of an impactful story that you captured that you said, I need to build a chapter around this.
Well, they're all really interesting and it's really hard. Sometimes you just want to tell the story, but as my
Right.
editor says, this is a great story and I really want to meet this person, but how does it tie into the chapter? So I do want to highlight that every story reinforces the chapter. One of them is Her Excellency Dr. Rosalia Ortega, the first woman president of Ecuador, who was deposed by a military coup. And she shares her story of how, she started as a teacher and, opportunities. She's in the opportunities happen chapter and how you take advantage of opportunities. And she eventually, she was asked to run. She was elected as the first female vice president, then became the president, then was deposed by a military coup. And this was in the 80s. And now her career, you can see her, she's all over leading nonprofits, advocating for education globally, serving on multiple boards. And so how you take advantage of opportunities, you have ups and downs in your career. She's a great example, and how you rise again. And so that's just one incredible story that's
Wow.
in this first book.
That's amazing. And it's that story of resiliency that I think is so captivating and really helps to inspire others, that we think it's hard to say I've lost the battle, but realize that may put you in a better position for the war ahead, if you will. And it sounds like she certainly lost the battle, but definitely is winning the war. So in that respect, you talked about the leadership principle that she embodied. And do you mind just kind of expanding on that a little bit for us to give us a sense of, if someone picks up your book, what are these? Because this is summer reads. And so we're hoping that someone's at the beach or at the cabin or whatever reading your book. And it sounds perfect because it's these lessons that we can pick up and digest. Give us a little bit of a lens into one of those, that lesson you just shared.
Well, what I'll do is actually share a little bit about the book because it is a fast, easily digestible book that's perfect for the summer. It's not one of those books that's blah, blah, blah. It actually, it starts out with a little intro. It talks a little bit about my journey, why that lesson resonates with me. And then there are those 3 short, quick global thought leader stories that share and reinforce that lesson learned. And then what's really great is the last part, which is transforming insights into action. It really gives the reader, what can they do next? It's great to read stories. It's great to read about lessons, but what can I do next? What books can I read? What podcasts? What free courses? And so every chapter ends with that transforming insights into action so that the readers can actually implement the thoughts. So what I'll say is for that first chapter we talked about with Dr. Ortega, that was about taking advantage of opportunities. And that's something I shared in the book when I was an enlisted airman. So I joined the Air Force right out of high school. I didn't have college money. I didn't know what I wanted to study. So the military was a great option to accomplish those, plus get to see the world. And while I was in the military, I was able to take advantage of tuition assistance and go to school at night, which allowed me to complete my bachelor's and master's degrees, which opened the door to my second chapter, becoming a space acquisition officer. We'll get there later. So taking advantage of opportunities, and sometimes opportunities look like work. So yeah.
I love a good opportunity described hidden as work. I love it. Disguised as work.
Well, it does. Because, just because I got tuition assistance to go to school, that didn't mean that I didn't have to go to school at night or on the weekends while my friends and peers were out doing fun things and I'm writing papers. But sometimes these opportunities are work, taking on hard projects, volunteering for organizations to fill skills that might be missing or lacking in your resume so you can beef things up so you get the next job. So a lot of times opportunities might look like work, but they pay off in the long run. So it's an investment, as I say, in your development. And so we talked about Dr. Ortega, and she never had a goal to run for politics, but what happened is opportunities opened and she stepped through the door. And so sometimes when people see opportunities, they might look like work. They might look like something I'm not comfortable with that's outside my comfort zone, but be confident. Step outside your comfort zone. Take advantage of those opportunities.
I love that. And this podcast has 2 audiences, and it's clearly the executive trying to upskill their game, but also I use these in my classes as required readings. And so students as well are thinking about stepping into the world. So what advice would you have first for those students stepping out into the world Isn't my degree enough? Shouldn't that get me into the slipstream of life? Or is there more work to be done in your experience?
So that is a great example for the chapter on get out from behind your desk.
Love it. Let's go.
Many times people sit behind their desk, they work really diligently, or their resume or their degree, and I'm just perfect. But really, life is about getting out from behind your desk. Everybody's got a degree. Everybody's working hard. We'll assume everyone's working hard. And my example for that was I was new to the Pentagon, and there was a special an event taking place one evening, and nobody in my department was going to go. And I didn't know anybody because I was still new to the Pentagon.
Of a reason to stay home, isn't it?
It's easy just to go home from work, right? It's at the end of the day. Everybody's going home, go home. But instead, I went to the event. I looked around the room, didn't really know a lot of people, but I slowly, the couple people I knew, I went around and said hello to. And in one corner, my boss's boss was there. He's a senior executive in the military, and that's the equivalent of a general officer, but he's a civilian. Now, fortunately, I knew him because I took one of those volunteering hard projects about 3 months earlier. His exec, which is normally a captain or major in the Air Force, went on vacation and they needed somebody to fill in, and I raised my hand. Now, when you become an executive officer, that's only working half days, 12 hours.
You had me for a second. I admit you had me.
You're there before your boss, the senior executive, gets in, and you're there after he leaves, and you're making sure everything's ready to go. So the 2 weeks was one of those volunteering for the hard assignments, the hard projects. It was work, but here it was 3 months later. I knew him and he knew me because during that time, he got to know me too. As a matter of fact, one day he said, "Brunswick, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Sir, someday I want your job." And he just laughed and thought that was funny. So I made an impression. So there he was in the corner talking to somebody, and I made my way over, and he kind of looked at me and he's like, "Brunswick, what have you been doing?" And I said, "Well, sir, I'm waiting for you to move me to my next opportunity." And the person he talked to, he looked at him, looked at me. The person he was talking to was his legislative liaison that worked on Capitol Hill for the Air Force, that talked about the programs in the Air Force that needed funding. That person had just got an assignment and they needed to replace him.
Wow.
And the boss's boss, the senior executive, looked at me and said, "Brunswick, how would you like to be a legislative liaison?" Now, he didn't give me the job, but what he did is he gave me an opportunity to interview. And I prepared. I talked to that person who was leaving. I got the job. It changed the course of my career in the military because up until then, I was a program manager, project management for space programs. I now became a legislative liaison of government affairs working on Capitol Hill. And again, it was because I got out from behind my desk that night, made the rounds. I was still doing a good job. I'd volunteered, took on that hard project, took advantage of opportunities. So that senior executive knew me and it opened a doorway. So sometimes you have to volunteer for these harder projects. Don't just go home at night. Get out from behind your desk.
I love that. And, when listening to your story, it was a mix of vulnerability and risk. Those are my words. You can put your own in. But is it too affront to go up to someone and just say, "This is what I want"? Is there a risk in that?
Well, I think there's a line between building some rapport. I mean, I have people on LinkedIn who I don't know reach out and say, "Will you write a letter of recommendation?" Okay, that's a little too much when you don't know somebody. But you have to remember, I had built rapport with this senior executive. I had worked with him for 2 weeks. He got to know me. He actually stayed at night. He and his deputy would sit and talk in the office, and I would learn from what they said. They included me. So you want to build some rapport before you make your ask. One of the other leaders in the book, who's in chapter 1 also on opportunities, is Antonio Stark, a young space professional from Korea. And he talks about how, we have to understand that it's not about being so direct. And he especially comes from a culture that's not about directness. It's about building that relationship and then being able to make the ask and understanding the dynamics of relationship building, especially across different cultures around the world.
And that's what's so key, especially today, is completely second nature to work across time zones, to work across borders, to work across continents, is to understand the cultural relevance of that country you're working with. So if it's an Asian culture, I always remember one of my colleagues said, "Jeff, just remember, in our culture, the tall poppy gets cut." And I learned so much there. And then when you work in the Middle East and it's a very top-down culture, it's not a place where you want to start trouble from the bottom up, so to speak. And so being that cultural awareness is key, building the rapport that you just shared to give yourself the right to make that ask, in the context of respect, but yet forwarding yourself is the beautiful balance. And I'll sound like the old man here, but I hope that's not something that's lost as we do more digital communication. With that being said, what can the senior executive take from either that lesson or another lesson within your book to help them in this confidence, in this ability to seize opportunities?
Well, excellent. So chapter 8 is about awareness of what you're focused on and being focused on goals, because we can get distracted. But one of the people I interviewed was Machiko Gozen, a 13th generation samurai woman. So she's from Japan. I met her at Dubai Expo, where she was there for Space Week. And I learned a lot from her. And one of the things I'll share with you, as the samurai are, they're very quick. And what she says is, it's okay. Move fast. Be quick. It's okay to make mistakes because failure is okay. It's recovering from failure. And so I learned a lot from her talk about failure is okay. Move quickly, because sometimes you get lost in paralysis by analysis, as you know. And so move quickly, make a decision, recover. And then she also talked about, you talked about it earlier, standing on the shoulder of giants. She shared about how we're all here because of our ancestors. Her ancestors, and it's very important in the Japanese culture, but we're all here. My ancestors are not originally from North America. So we're all here standing on decisions from our ancestors up to where we are today. So I thought it was really deep insight as to what she shared. And I put a lot of her insights that will also be in the third book coming out on Out of This World Leadership.
I think building off of a culture with such a rich tradition as the samurai, and I think that's why that class is so venerated in Japanese culture, is it's typical within Japanese culture to fear failure, because failure can bring shame, and shame is a generational characteristic in the normal family structure. But with the samurai, they're gifted with that ability, as you said, to reframe it from failure to recovery. And I think that's what executives miss when they think about growing their business, is they work from a place of avoiding failure. My tenure is going to be 2, 3, at best 4 years in this top role. I want to maximize my earnings in this position. So they become risk averse, where in reality, the best thing that they can embody in that organization is a sense of recovery, which is ironic because that's an unintended space reference, recovery.
Well, and in the space industry, you see that they're moving quickly. They're trying things. If it doesn't work, what did I learn from this? And how can I move forward quickly? And you see that with multiple space companies where they don't have the burn rate of capital to analyze everything. Sometimes it's quicker and cheaper just to do it. And then if you have an anomaly, which is usually a explosion or something, then did you capture data so that you make sure you don't do it again? It's a lot easier to recover than try to get to 100%, perfection.
And that's actually an interesting point that you bring up, because in the space program, you can't fail at 100% because that means the loss of life. And so exactly what you talked about is that ability to test, where we say perfection's the enemy of progress. If I try and make it 100% before I test it, I'll never get anywhere. But if we have the confidence to test a 25% or a 50% hypothesis, knowing that failure is likely, but we've set up a system to collect data, iterate, and recover before we get humans into that. That's how the space programs move forward.
Absolutely. Well, and that's how I think any bootstrapping startup entrepreneur starts, not just the space industry. I think we highlight them a lot, but I think when you look at bootstrappers, they're doing a lot with very few resources, and that creates ingenuity.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. Shelli, we've been talking about opportunities and the ability to take risk, but to take risk with intention, having done the work behind the scenes so that when you do put yourself out there, you've given yourself the best chance to succeed. And more importantly, if that doesn't work out, to have that strength to recover. And the space industry is a wonderful example of that. Since this is a strategy podcast, if I may ask you a question, a lot's been made about SpaceX. And since we last spoke, actually, SpaceX successfully, as I'll use the word chopstick, recovered the booster rocket as it came back to Earth. But, through a business model perspective, what has been so disruptive about these startup space companies, if you will, versus the legacy contractors? And is there any parallels from that kind of case study back to what you've experienced?
So I'm actually going to pull this linear thought in a different way and kind of turn your question. Having worked in military acquisition and understanding that, as well as policymakers on Capitol Hill, it really starts with legislation. And what I mean by that is when we're talking about SpaceX, but SpaceX could not have existed, or Blue Origin or Rocket Lab, had the Congress not made legislation in 2004 that allowed for space companies to exist. Because up until then, you had to be a government agency to launch a rocket, and launch costs were exceedingly expensive because it was government only. Once 2004 legislation happened and it was signed into law, that's what allowed these space companies to rise. But it wasn't only that. It was also NASA doing public-private partnerships, doing some funding into those capabilities. And they're repeating that model again because we're going to deorbit the International Space Station in 2030. And NASA has awarded some contracts to provide that seed funding for potentially commercial space stations. So I'm going to start with your question. It really depends on the leadership of each nation, especially the lawmakers, to say what kind of framework do we want to have that allows for commercialization or whatever it is. We know Luxembourg in the space industry, they're not launching rockets, but they have the best business framework for companies to incorporate in their nation. Right now, they're the leaders. The U.S. has some challenges because there's a lot of space in different buckets of the government that I'm sure that's trying to be sorted out to be more efficient. So that strategy of how companies can rise and be successful starts with policy. And I think a little bit of that seed funding, because when it's not in a company's best interest to do something, why would they do it? But when the government comes in as your partner, that helps a little bit. So I'm going to start with policy. Then I'm going to say, once you had that, you had some serious business people. I read Elon Musk's book, how he took out a pencil and he's like, okay, a rocket is this amount and it's this amount. Why is it costing this amount, right?
Yeah.
There's a big delta.
First principles, right?
Right. There was a big delta between what he thought it could cost and what it was actually costing the U.S. government. Now, when you're a sole source and you're only launching 1 or 2 rockets a year, that adds to a lot of cost. But what he looked at was, well, if I start launching rockets multiple times a year, I lower the cost curve. And that's exactly what happened. It's not so much what Elon Musk did. Yes, SpaceX is great. But now there's space companies that are launching payloads for exponentially reduced cost, which has now opened up space to more than just developed space nations. Emerging nations, universities, organizations around the world can now launch their own payload into space. It might be a CanSat, maybe nanosats, but now you're seeing that access to space is becoming more available to countries. I just saw in the April SpaceX launch, Bahrain, Zimbabwe, all launched satellites. As a matter of fact, the one from Bahrain was actually built in Bahrain. So your human capability, we're doing capacity building in emerging countries, emerging space nations. You're giving them access to telecommunications, Earth observation. So that SpaceX example, started by legislation, created this opportunity that's now global.
That's a wonderful, wonderful walk through that history, and not only the history, but also the opportunity that lies ahead. And I think what Elon did very adeptly was say, well, where's the choke point in that? And the choke point is literally breaking Earth's gravitational pull And if he monopolizes that choke point, if you will, then he can, he's indifferent to if it's Zimbabwe, Bahrain, or the United States who launches that satellite or that into orbit. So I think that's absolutely fascinating in that respect. And so with that all being said, as you think about future books, how much is going to be, again, pardon the pun, but Earth-based knowledge, right? And how much of this series that you're authoring is going to be about the potential of what could be and kind of planting those seeds of thought and inspiration for others?
Well, I'm so fortunate that I have a few outlets that I write for. So I have my book series, which is more focused on career development and opportunities. And I use space examples. So SpaceX, Rocket Lab, they're being used examples for that space inspiration. But I also write for Forbes Technology Council. And a lot of what I put into Forbes is related to space companies, many of them that people don't know. I'll have a article coming out soon that talks about space and healthcare, heart, blindness, bone loss. I mean, so many things that are terrifying diseases on Earth, macular degeneration, to go blind as you get older, and then there's no cure, are now being looked at for space to help enable the solution. So I put all of those a lot in my Forbes Technology Council articles. And then I just started writing a new column for Global Trends magazine, and that's really more focused on entrepreneurship. So you might enjoy that. I have to limit it.
Well, we're going to link to it and in the notes. Tell us a sense of what you're communicating in that column, what you're sharing.
So my first column came out in May, and I have to keep it short, so that's challenging, 510 words. That's the hardest part. But I'm really highlighting the traits of entrepreneurs, and then highlighting what those traits are, those skills. And then I'm using some really cutting edge examples of space startup companies that you may have not heard. Like we've already talked about Rocket Lab, SpaceX, Blue Origin, but there are so many companies that are looking at, putting up solar arrays in space so that we can have power on Earth, limitless power on Earth. There's so many companies that are out there trying to solve really challenging Earth problems using space that I really want to promote those companies and their leaders in this series on entrepreneurship. And eventually I'll turn that into a book as well.
Well, that would be a fascinating read to understand the possibilities. I mean, one thing that just came to my mind as you're talking is we talk about medical tourism here on Earth, but what if you can more effectively treat conditions in low Earth orbit or outer space, whatever term the correct term is, and assuming people can handle the travel, that they can actually be sent to space for treatment and brought back to Earth because that's a better cure. Is that science fiction, or is there like a path to that actually being true?
That is so wonderful. I was just at a conference this weekend called the SMED Symposium, where it's SMED scholars from the University of Colorado Boulder. It's all the PhDs that are in their engineering program. And we were talking about that type of tourism, healthcare tourism, because there are so many things you can do in a microgravity environment that we can't do on Earth. So absolutely, that is going to be a reality. We're also already looking at how do we 3D print replacements for human parts. We can't do it right now on Earth because organic material doesn't 3D print very well in gravity. But that's how one company, I talked about macular degeneration in Lambda Vision, they're 3D printing lens replacements on the International Space Station that will eventually start going through the FDA approval. And we may someday have a cure for macular degeneration, but it was actually 3D printed in space.
With components or parts printed in outer space.
Exactly. Because the organic material, the way the protein layers print here on Earth, there's just too many anomalies, and you don't want to use that in the human body. And so, yes, we will probably use 3D printed parts for our organic material for our human parts, whether that's a valve replacement in your heart or limb, joint replacements might come. But yes, they are talking about how there could be and will be potentially surgeries in space because of that microgravity environment.
That's amazing. And, these are the types of conversations I really hope to have in this series because it sparks that curiosity. We always say good ideas come in the shower or during a nap or on a long walk. And in this case, you've planted some wonderful seeds about what could be in that future. So with that being said, take us through your optimistic lens, not the outlier case, but, what's a 50-50 shot of sort of space innovations that we can expect in the next 25 years? Is this healthcare application something we can consider? Is a lunar base something we consider? Will we be using minerals mined from outer space? Like, what are some of the business cases that you actually think are closer than the average person thinks they would be?
Absolutely. Well, I think you talked about, mining asteroids. That's one of the things Luxembourg has passed legislation on, is that mining can take place and what the rights are to the mining of those activities. So in 25 years, we'll be closer to that. I do see the cislunar economy. I mean, we have a bit of a cislunar economy already. We're already living on telecommunications. I mean, we're already using Apollo era telecommunications to talk today. This is the same type of technology they created 60 years ago. So NASA could talk to astronauts. So every time somebody gets on a Zoom, just think about it. It's just like you're talking to an astronaut.
How cool.
So we're going to continue to develop that low Earth orbit applications with internet, especially when you look at a lot of nations around the world still don't have internet connectivity. Think about the island nations around the equator. The only way we're going to be able to connect them to the global economy is through space-based internet. So there's going to still be a lot of opportunity to bring countries into the global economy that have still not been a part of that. We're going to be able to give them better weather forecasting and Earth observation. Just think about it. You're in an island nation in the equator and you don't have information to good weather forecasting and a tsunami is coming. So we're going to help a lot of nations with this space infrastructure in low Earth orbit. But as we go on to the moon, absolutely, there's going to be a lot of opportunities. There are companies that are talking about mining helium-3, which is an energy source. There are companies talking about space solar arrays so that we can have limitless free power on Earth. As these commercial space stations happen, and, the International Space Station is already congested, there's a lot of work for the astronauts to do. So as commercial space stations happen, the ISS goes away, the U.S. government will just be a tenant. It's just like a mall. They'll be like Macy's. The corner tenant will be the U.S. government. There might be, ESA. There'll be some tenants that do their research for national security or national civil space, such as NASA. But then you're going to allow these companies, like those healthcare companies. There's a lot of things we're learning from space. We know like women develop osteoporosis on Earth, but what we've learned from women in space is they develop it almost 10 times faster.
Wow.
And so there's an opportunity to learn what's happening to female astronauts. Can we come up with better solutions to help female astronauts as we want to become an interplanetary species and go on to Mars? Because this will be a problem. But we can also solve that healthcare here on Earth. We know for men, when you're in microgravity environment, our circulatory system is dependent on gravity. Well, when you're in microgravity, whether that's low Earth orbit or the moon or Mars, which again, all have different gravitational pulls, it's going to have an effect on our circulatory system. They see a lot of that with the male astronauts, but they're using that now to study heart disease, circulatory system problems here on Earth. So we can use that microgravity environment. So you're going to see as we're continuing to put research centers on the moon, potentially go on to Mars. Now we're already on Mars. I want to make that clear. I hear this, on to Mars. We are on Mars. We've been on Mars for years. We've got rovers on Mars.
See the picture that you may not be able to see it, but that picture is the Mars rover, right? I mean,
exactly.
And I just want to emphasize that because I think it gets lost in the day to day. Is we've literally piloted a helicopter on Mars from Earth.
With no gravity, right? There's very little atmosphere, very little gravity. Lift for aircrafts is dependent on atmosphere. So the JPL scientists who were able to have Ingenuity fly with minimal atmosphere and gravity, I mean, incredible. And that is going to be the real wave, right? It's going to be artificial intelligence, autonomous navigation, some autonomous decision-making. We're going to continue with robotics. Are we going to have thousands of humans out in space in the next 25 years? I'm not sure thousands, but it might be more human in the loop with AI, virtual reality, robotics, some autonomous decision-making for navigation and activities. I could see potentially some humans on Mars in the next 25 years. Will we have a huge settlement? The UAE in the next 100 years wants to have a research center on Mars. 100 years for that, absolutely possible. 25 years, maybe not so possible. But, it's all dependent. I'm a program manager by heart, so it's cost, schedule, and performance. At the end of the day, you can do anything with lots of money and time.
There you go. And time is the great equalizer. And I think that's something key that you touched on is particularly in today's society where our time horizon continues to be shrunk by social media, et cetera, and the expectation that I need to make certain achievements in my lifetime. I need to make X amount of dollars. I need to be promoted to Y title. And this inward focus that we have as a society is actually one of the biggest risks to space, because it inherently forces you to think outside of yourself and assume in that samurai mindset that you're just one of many generations going after a goal. I think that's hard for some folks. And so it's what makes people like you so special, who, go beyond themselves and understand that you're actually working towards something bigger. And that involves not only passing on your knowledge to those who will come after you, but also painting an inspiring picture for them about what is possible.
Absolutely. Chapter 10 is all about that. Passion, patience, and perseverance. Right? We all have goals in our life. I'm going to make partner at this stage, or I'm going to do this, or I'll be a billionaire or a startup entrepreneur success. And, most entrepreneurs fail the first few times as long as you learn from that. So the biggest thing I'll share is you have to have that passion that drives you. The patience, because it'll probably take longer than you think, and the perseverance to keep going when you have setbacks. And the other thing is shut off social media. I mean, I am out there. Please follow me. I post information and things like that, but I don't look at what other people are doing and then compare it to myself. I think that is a really hard thing, to not look at what compare ourselves to others. Compare yourself to yourself. Kobe Bryant. He wanted to be the best basketball player. It wasn't about competing against somebody else. He was competing against himself. Compete against yourself. Every day I do that. I have like 6 main focus areas I have every day. I may not hit all 6. I might hit 1, but did I do a lot? Did I write a chapter in a book, or did I write an article? Or, you got to kind of focus on what are your goals, and then just keep after them little by little every day, and you'll get there. Don't compare yourself to somebody else. And if somebody else has a great success on social media, applaud them, congratulate them. It's good karma.
It absolutely is. And I can't emphasize what you said enough. And it's always going to be important to me is the value of personal communications, and just the inspiration that I get from 45 minutes with you is enough to carry me through the day, Shelli, for sure. And I know that it carries our guests through their day. Just reflecting on what we talked about, when you touched on the idea of opportunities and finding opportunities as inspiration, but more importantly, how are you preparing yourself for those opportunities? I always go back to this saying, luck is where opportunity meets preparation. If I get lucky, it's only because I prepared. And that's what I even go as far as to share that with my daughter. It's like I said, I don't care about your grades. I care about, did you do the work leading up to it, right? Everybody can make an error, a physical error, but as long as you're not making the mental error of preparation, that's the issue. So I'm glad to hear you reinforce that. And when you do make an error, it's not about the fall, it's about the recovery.
Absolutely.
Yes. And just touching on your final 3 that really resonated with me: passions, patience, perseverance. You have to have a passion for what you're doing. Patience, because time is that great equalizer, if I may. And perseverance, it ties back to what you just said. That samurai mindset of recovery is so powerful. So, Shelli, just thank you for all that you shared. Anything that I haven't asked you about, either your book or the topics that you've covered in there, that you'd just like to touch on while we have a minute?
Well, I'll just share, in addition to the book, which is available on Amazon, I did create a webinar series that's on YouTube, complimentary, where I interviewed some of the 30 thought leaders. So you can check out that on YouTube, see what you think, get some of their insights, or check out the book too. And then I look forward to continuing to see you around the galaxy. I look forward to our next talk.
Well, we've talked about it. You have a second book coming out in conjunction with Space Week in October. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's going to be What Space Got to Do with It, an interstellar guide to success. Because a lot of times, as soon as we talk about space and the space economy, people come over and say, well, how do I do that? How do I make that happen? So this is kind of more of a linear process of leadership, awareness, access, and action. It's giving some people some tangible ways to build their success so that they can accomplish those things. Yes, I look at it through that lens of space, but I also give suggestions that will help anybody who's trying to accomplish things in their life. So an Interstellar Guide to Success, it's going to come out of World Space Week, the 4th through the 11th of October. And I'll have a few webinars with the individuals that I'm interviewing for that book as well, going on during World Space Week. And just so everyone knows, World Space Week takes place around the world. You can go online, you can register to attend these events for free. It's a wonderful way to learn more about the space industry and gain some insights.
I love that it's no longer a US centric conversation or this bipolar conversation of the US versus, Russia, et cetera, and China, if you add them as the third leg. But the point being is that, India has successfully landed on the moon. Japan has visited the moon. There's private companies that have landed on the moon. And so in all of these instances, there's other players out there. And what I find so inspiring about our talks is that you do focus through this very inspirational lens of space, but the truisms, you talked about the first principles Elon Musk used. I think you go back to first principles as well and lay such a beautiful framework that we can build any business on. And if our business doesn't have a moonshot in the bag, so to speak, well, what the heck? Let's get off our backside and make one ourselves.
Absolutely. I saw International Space University has said that their new president has come out. He calls it Moonshot 2030. So make your own moonshot. You can do it.
I love it. I love it. Well, thanks so much, Shelli. We'll be sure to put all of this, all of these wonderful links in the show notes. And with that, I always say, well, we're a big fan of things that are big, right? Berkeley Innovation Group. We're all things that are big, and then you drop your little space line. Well, Shelli, thanks so much for everything. And from my side, I can always say, I always think to go big. And in your world, going big means
I'll see you around the galaxy.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Shelli. We'll talk to you soon.